Every generation gets its myth. For us, it's 3i Atlas, a wandering body from another star that behaves just a little too perfectly for comfort. NASA says comet, but every press release feels rehearsed, every delay deliberate, and somehow it fits too neatly into every human fear, the unknown, the divine, the alien. What if this is Project Blue Beam returning under a new name? What if this mystery has been deliberately designed to be unsolved? A celestial illusion built to unite through fear? Stay with me until the end, because come December 15th, 2025, the real revelation might not be in the sky, but in how all along we were conditioned to see it. If this mystery has you hooked the way it has me, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single update as this unfolds in real time. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from, what time it is there, and whether you believe we're getting the full truth about this world-changing discovery. And if you want to help this community grow, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or even just in your group chats. You're the reason we can keep chasing stories like this, so thank you for having our back. Part 1. The Alien You're Meant to See. Picture this. December the 15th, 2025. You wake up, check your phone, and every newsfeed is flooded with the same image. A glowing object hangs in the pre-dawn sky, broadcast live from telescopes across 6 continents. NASA scientists stand at podiums, their faces carefully neutral, using words like unprecedented and unexplained. The internet is already on fire. Someone's claiming it's a probe. Someone else is quoting Revelation. Your neighbour thinks it's the end times. And somewhere, in a control room you'll never see, someone is watching all of us react. But let's rewind. Let's go back to when this story actually started, because the timing is almost too perfect to be coincidence. The Atlas survey, an automated telescope network scanning for near-Earth asteroids, picked up something strange in early 2025. At first, it looked like a routine catch, just another chunk of ice and rock drifting through the solar system. Except this one wasn't behaving like it should. Its trajectory calculations came back wrong. Not wrong like measurement error wrong. Wrong like this thing came from outside our solar system wrong. Interstellar. Only the 3rd confirmed visitor from beyond our cosmic neighbourhood. They named it 3i Atlas, and that's when things started getting weird. The verified facts are these. 3i Atlas arrived on a hyperbolic trajectory, meaning it's moving too fast to be gravitationally bound to our Sun. It came from somewhere else. That part is real. What happened after perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun, is where reality starts to blur. The comet experienced brightness surges, flares of light that could be explained by outgassing, which is what comets do when solar radiation heats their icy cores and material jets into space. Totally natural. Except some of those surges didn't match the models. And then there was the acceleration. Lateral acceleration. A slight change in trajectory that wasn't purely gravitational. Again, outgassing can cause this. Comets are messy, chaotic things. But the timing and direction raised eyebrows. Raised enough eyebrows that NASA added pending review notes to their public database. And that's when the internet lost its mind. Because here's what people saw. NASA discovers interstellar object. NASA releases some data. NASA experiences brief database outages. NASA adds pending review flags. NASA goes quiet for exactly the amount of time it takes for speculation to metastasize into certainty. By the time official clarifications came out, calling it a natural comet with expected anomalies, half the world had already decided this was a cover-up. The other half was arguing about which cover-up it was. Alien probe, government weapons test, biblical prophecy. Take your pick. You've seen this movie before, haven't you? Every few years, something appears in the sky that we can't immediately explain, and the same. Cycle plays out. Observe, speculate, panic, debunk, repeat. But what if this time the cycle is the point? What if the confusion isn't a bug in the system but a feature? What if 3i Atlas isn't an alien spacecraft pretending to be a comet, but a comet being stage-managed to feel alien? Consider the paradox at the centre of this whole spectacle. We're told that NASA is hiding the truth, that they know it's extraterrestrial and won't admit it. But what if the truth they're hiding is exactly the opposite? What if the secret is that they want us to believe it's alien? That the drip feed of ambiguous data, the perfectly timed gaps in information, the way official statements always seem to leave just enough room for doubt, what if all of that is intentional? Not censorship, curation. This isn't a story about a comet, it's a story about control, specifically the control of meaning. Because whoever gets to decide what that light in the sky represents gets to shape how billions of people feel about their place in the universe. And right now, in 2025, that power sits in very few hands. NASA controls the telescopes, they control the data pipelines, they control the press releases, they essentially control the sky itself, or at least our access to it. When you look up and wonder what you're seeing, you're not really looking at the cosmos, you're looking through a lens someone else is holding. There's a name for what happens when information is carefully parceled out to maximize psychological impact. It's called perception management, and it's a recognized field of study in both military and intelligence communities. The goal isn't to lie, necessarily. It's to frame, to guide interpretation, to make people arrive at conclusions that serve a larger strategic purpose. And if you think that sounds paranoid, consider that we've been living through a deliberate acclimatization process for nearly a decade now. Ever since 2017, when the Pentagon released those Navy pilot videos showing unidentified aerial phenomena, UAPs, we've been fed a steady diet of cosmic uncertainty. Congressional hearings, whistleblowers, declassified footage, each revelation just ambiguous enough to keep the conversation alive without ever quite resolving it. That's not accident. That's architecture. We're being conditioned to accept that something is out there, without ever being told exactly what. And 3i Atlas fits perfectly into that pattern. It's the next chapter in a story someone started writing years ago. A story where the line between discovery and disclosure gets blurrier every day, and where the biggest question isn't what's in the sky, but who's controlling the narrative about it. So here's the thesis, the idea we're going to chase through every twist of this investigation. 3i Atlas is a mirror. It reflects back whatever you're afraid of or whatever you're hoping for. Alien contact, divine judgment, government conspiracy, scientific, wonder, and the genius of it, the truly unsettling brilliance, is that it works no matter what the object actually is, because the object isn't the operation. We are. Our reactions, our fears, our need to know, that's the data being collected. That's the experiment. And if you think I'm about to tell you that 3i Atlas is definitely a psyop, you're going to be disappointed. Because the truth is more complicated and more disturbing than any single answer. What I'm about to show you is how ambiguity itself has become a weapon. How not knowing can be more powerful than knowing. How the question mark hovering over that comet might be the whole point. So buckle up. We're about to pull back the curtain on the most elaborate magic trick ever performed, where the audience is 7 billion people, the stage is the entire solar system, and the trick is making you believe that what you're seeing is real, even when real has stopped meaning anything at all, because the countdown has already started. December 15th is coming, and someone, somewhere, is watching to see what we do next. Part 2. Controlled Ambiguity, NASA's Perfect Storm. Let's talk about timing, because timing is everything in magic and in perception management. When 3i Atlas was first detected, the initial data release followed standard protocols: orbital parameters, brightness measurements, spectroscopic analysis indicating water ice and organic compounds, all the things you'd expect from a comet. Then came the first delay. Raw telescope images that should have been published within 72 hours were held for additional processing. NASA's explanation was reasonable, technical even. They needed to correct for sensor artifacts and calibrate the data properly. Nothing unusual, except that during those 72 hours, speculation online went from 0 to critical mass. You can track it if you know where to look. The first Reddit post questioning the delay appeared 11 hours after the expected release time. By hour 24, YouTube videos with titles like NASA hiding alien comet evidence had racked up hundreds of thousands of views. By hour 48, mainstream news outlets were running stories about the public's concerns over transparency. And by the time NASA finally released those images, with perfectly mundane explanations for every anomaly, it didn't matter. The narrative had crystallized. Once people believe you're hiding something, showing them there's nothing to hide just makes them believe you're hiding it better. This pattern repeated itself 6 times between February and September 2025. Data delay, speculation spike, official clarification, continued skepticism, like clockwork. And here's what makes it fascinating. These delays weren't unprecedented. They happened during the Wormwood event back in 2017, that cigar-shaped interstellar visitor that kicked off this whole modern era of cosmic paranoia. Same centralized data servers, same peer review cycles, same institutional caution about releasing information before it's been properly vetted. The infrastructure hasn't changed. What's changed is how we interpret the gaps. Because somewhere between 2017 and now, we learned a new way of reading silence. We learned that when institutions pause, it might mean they're hiding something. When they say under review, it might mean too dangerous for public consumption. When they use words like unexpected, it might mean they're softening us up for something bigger. This interpretive framework didn't appear out of nowhere. It was taught to us piece by piece, through years of drip-fed disclosure about UAPs, through congressional testimonies that revealed just enough to be tantalizing, but never enough to be satisfying, through a carefully choreographed dance of revelation and restraint that made mystery feel like truth. Some researchers call this soft disclosure, the practice of gradually normalizing ideas that would have seemed absurd a generation ago. 20 years ago, if you talked about alien spacecraft at a dinner party, you were the weird one. Today you can watch former Navy pilots describe encounters with physics-defying objects on 60 Minutes, and nobody bats an eye. That shift didn't happen by accident, it happened because someone understood that you can't shock a population into accepting a new reality. You have to guide them there, step by careful step, until the impossible starts feeling inevitable. And the psychological mechanism that makes this work is surprisingly simple. It's called intermittent reinforcement, and it's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. When rewards come at unpredictable intervals, attention becomes obsessive. Rats will press a lever more persistently when treats arrive randomly than when they arrive on a schedule. Humans refresh news feeds more compulsively when major revelations drop without warning. NASA doesn't need to confirm 3i Atlas is alien, they just need to keep the possibility alive. Every ambiguous statement, every delayed image, every carefully worded press release that says, "We're seeing things we don't fully understand yet," is another pull of the slot machine lever. And we keep playing. Watch how the language works. When NASA scientists brief the press, they never say, "It's just a comet, move along." They say the data is consistent with natural cometary processes, but we're continuing to monitor for any deviations. They say current observations don't indicate artificial origin, but we can't rule anything out definitively. They're technically correct, because science never rules anything out definitively. But to the average person hearing that statement, it sounds like, maybe it's aliens, maybe it's not, stay tuned. The ambiguity is load-bearing. Remove it, and the whole structure collapses. And then mainstream media does what mainstream media does best, amplifies the institutional voice without questioning its framing. When NASA says unprecedented, every news outlet repeats unprecedented. When NASA says anomalous, the headlines scream anomalous. The repetition creates authority. After you've heard the same description from 10 different sources, it stops feeling like one organization's interpretation and starts feeling like objective reality. Never mind that all 10 sources are ultimately citing the same NASA press release. Never mind that independent astronomers with access to the same publicly available data are saying, yeah, it's probably just a comet behaving like comets do. The coordinated message drowns out the skeptical voices. Social media, of course, is where this dynamic reaches its final form. On X, formerly Twitter, hashtags like Alien Comet and Wormwood is coming trended within hours of each new NASA update. TikTok filled with amateur astronomers and self-proclaimed experts analysing blurry telescope footage frame by frame, finding faces in the static and geometry in the chaos. YouTube recommended algorithm learned that videos about 3i Atlas kept viewers watching, so it promoted more 3i Atlas content, creating a feedback loop where the most sensational interpretations rose to the top, while sober scientific explainers languished in obscurity. The platforms aren't neutral. They're engineered to reward engagement, and uncertainty is engaging in a way that certainty never is. Psychologists have a term for what happens to us in these situations. They call it ambiguity anxiety, the specific discomfort we feel when we can't categorize something clearly. Humans are pattern recognition machines. We need to fit new information into existing frameworks. When we can't, we experience cognitive stress. And here's the key insight: that stress makes us more likely to accept authoritative explanations, even partial ones, because any framework feels better than no framework. NASA doesn't need to convince you 3i Atlas is alien. They just need to convince you they're the ones who'll eventually tell you what it is. That dependency is the real goal. Think about it. Right now, thousands of amateur astronomers could be pointing their own telescopes at 3i Atlas, gathering their own data, publishing their own analyses, and some are. But when you read those independent reports, do you trust them the way you trust NASA? Probably not, because NASA has the institutional weight, the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, the scientists with fancy degrees and security clearances. They've positioned themselves as the interpreters of the cosmos, and most of us have accepted that role without question, which means they don't control the sky. They control something more valuable. They control what the sky means. So why would NASA want to maintain this fog of ambiguity? Why not just release everything at once and let the chips fall? Maybe because the ambiguity serves a purpose beyond this. Specific comet. Maybe 3i Atlas is a test, a trial run, a way of measuring how populations respond to cosmic uncertainty in the age of social media and instant global communication. You want to know how humanity would react to actual first contact? Don't wait for aliens to show up. Create a scenario that feels like first contact and watch what happens. Monitor the trending topics, track the sentiment analysis, see which narratives take hold and which ones fizzle. Build a predictive model for the real thing. And if that sounds too calculated, too cynical, remember that governments have been running psychological operations on their own citizens for as long as governments have existed. They called it propaganda once, then public relations, then strategic communication. Now it's perception management. The name changes, but the game stays the same. And in an era where information moves at light speed and belief systems fragment into 10,000 competing realities, the ability to guide collective interpretation becomes the ultimate strategic asset. So here we are, caught in NASA's perfect storm. Not enough information to know for certain. Too much information to ignore, just enough ambiguity to keep us hooked. And a creeping suspicion that the uncertainty might be the message. But if this is a script, where did the script come from? Who wrote the playbook for cosmic psyops? To answer that, we need to go back. Back to the conspiracy theories that predicted this exact scenario decades before it happened. Back to a plan so ambitious it sounded like science fiction. Back to Project Blue Beam. Part 3. Blueprints of Belief, the Project Blue Beam prototype. 1994. A Canadian journalist named Serge Monast publishes a report that most people dismiss as paranoid fantasy. He claims to have uncovered a secret NASA initiative called Project Blue Beam, a plan to simulate the second coming of Christ using holographic technology projected into the sky. According to Monast, this fake celestial event would be so convincing, so overwhelming, that the entire world would unite under a single global government in response. He described 4 stages. Massive earthquakes would unearth fake archaeological evidence disproving all established religions. Gigantic space shows would project religious imagery tailored to different cultures simultaneously. Telepathic communication would be beamed directly into people's brains using ELF waves. And finally, a staged alien invasion or divine arrival would terrify humanity into accepting a new world order. When Monast died suddenly in 1996, believers said he'd been silenced. Skeptics said he'd had a heart attack, and the conspiracy theory died with him. But here's the thing about ideas. They don't die, they evolve. And in 2025, with 3i Atlas hanging in the sky, and half the internet convinced it's either aliens or angels, Project Blue Beam doesn't sound quite so crazy anymore. Not because the original plan was real. There's no credible evidence NASA ever developed holographic Messiah projection technology. But because the underlying concept, using spectacular celestial events to manipulate mass belief, has become not only possible, but almost mundane. Let's inventory what exists right now in the real world, with verified technology that anyone can look up. Holographic advertising has been demonstrated in major cities worldwide. Satellite-based projection systems can display images visible across entire regions. Deepfake audio can replicate anyone's voice with near-perfect accuracy. Drone swarms can create dynamic formations in the night sky that look like solid objects. All the pieces are here, not to fake the second coming maybe, but to fake something. The genius of Monast's original vision wasn't the specific religious angle. It was the recognition that in the modern age, spectacle is control. You don't need to change reality. You just need to change what people perceive. And you don't even need to fool everyone. You just need to fool enough people to create a cascade effect where social proof does the rest of the work. If 10 million people see something in the sky and believe it's alien contact, the remaining 7 billion have to explain why they're not seeing it, which puts skeptics on the defensive and believers in the power position. Now let's talk about something that's not conspiracy theory, but documented fact: the Pentagon's budget allocations for perception management research. These are line items you can find in publicly available budget documents. Millions of dollars spent annually on understanding how populations respond to unexpected events, how information spreads through social networks, how authority figures can effectively shape public interpretation of ambiguous phenomena. They don't call it PSYOPs in the budget reports, they call it strategic communication or information operations, but the research is the same. How do you control what people believe when you can't control what people see? And space is the perfect laboratory for this kind of research, because space has always been about belief as much as physics. When Sputnik launched in 1957, the satellite itself was a technological marvel but not a strategic threat. It was a metal ball that beeped. But the psychological impact was profound. Americans looked up at the night sky and imagined Soviet technology passing overhead, watching them, threatening them. The government's response wasn't just to build better rockets, it was to manage the panic, to reassure, to redirect fear into productive national effort. Space race, moon landing, all of it was as much about controlling the story as achieving the milestone. Fast forward to 2017. Oumuamua arrives, that weird elongated asteroid or comet, or maybe spacecraft depending on who you ask. And what happens? The exact same script. Initial discovery. Scientific puzzlement over its strange acceleration. Avi Loeb, respected Harvard astrophysicist, publishes papers suggesting it could be an alien light sail. Media frenzy ensues. Other scientists push back, offering natural explanations. The debate rages for months, and by the time the object has left the solar system and can no longer be observed, we're left with ambiguity. No proof it was alien, no proof it wasn't. Just an unresolved question mark hanging in the collective consciousness. Look at that sequence again, because it's a perfect rehearsal. The public learns that interstellar objects exist and can behave strangely. The public learns that even credentialed scientists can disagree wildly about interpretation. The public learns that some mysteries don't get solved, and that's okay. The public gets comfortable with not knowing. That's conditioning. That's infrastructure. Building the psychological framework that will support whatever comes next. And what comes next, apparently, is 3i Atlas. Same script, bigger stage. Interstellar trajectory, check. Anomalous behavior, check. Scientific debate, check. Media coverage, check. But this time with an extra ingredient that makes it all more potent: religious symbolism. Because someone, whether by accident or design, noticed that this comet's arrival coincides with apocalyptic expectations already simmering in certain communities. And once that connection got made, once the hashtag Wormwood started trending, the psychological payload multiplied exponentially. Project Bluebeam 2.0 doesn't need holograms of Jesus. It just needs a comet that enough people interpret as significant. The technology isn't in the sky, it's in the live stream infrastructure that broadcasts the same images to billions of devices simultaneously. It's in the social media algorithms that amplify certain interpretations over others. It's in the 24/7 news cycle that needs to fill airtime with something, so why not cosmic mystery? The apparatus for mass perception management already exists. It's just been democratized, distributed, made invisible through ubiquity. We're all carrying the projection equipment in our pockets. Here's what keeps me up at night: the realization that you could run a Bluebeam-style operation without any actual deception. You don't need to fake anything in the sky. You just need to let ambiguity do the work. Release real data in carefully timed increments. Use language that's technically accurate but emotionally suggestive. Create space for multiple interpretations. Then step back and watch as true believers, skeptics, and everyone in between battle it out online, each side amplifying the mystery by trying to resolve it. The government doesn't need to lie, they just need to manage the conversation. That's the upgrade. That's the evolution of the blueprint. And the beauty of it, from a strategic perspective, is that it's unfalsifiable. If 3i Atlas turns out to be exactly what NASA says it is, a natural comet with interesting but explainable properties, then there was no hoax, no harm, no foul. But the psychological experiment still happened. The data on human reaction still got collected, the model still got refined. If it turns out to be something stranger, well, the population has already been primed to handle that revelation. Either way, someone wins. So when you look up at the sky on December 15th and see that glowing object, ask yourself, am I seeing the thing itself, or am I seeing the stage-managed version of the thing? And more importantly, does the difference even matter anymore? Because in the age of mediated reality, where everything we know about the cosmos gets filtered through institutions and algorithms, the distinction between discovery and disclosure collapses. We don't find things out there, we're told about them, and whoever controls the telling controls the meaning. But there's another layer to this. A religious amplifier that's been feeding off 3i Atlas since day one, turning a scientific curiosity into an eschatological countdown. An ancient prophecy that's found new life in 21st century social media. A name that carries weight across cultures and centuries. We need to talk about Wormwood. Part 4. The Prophecy Feedback Loop. Open your Bible to Revelation chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Written 2,000 years ago, allegedly describing the end times, and in 2025 trending worldwide as an explanation for 3i Atlas. The connection is obvious enough that you don't need to be a biblical scholar to make it. A celestial object arrives from beyond. It blazes across the sky. It has a name that sounds ominous, 3i Atlas, which in Greek mythology involves holding up the heavens, and that's close enough to cosmic significance for the parallels to write themselves. Add in the December approach date, the fact that it's coming during a time of intense global anxiety, and the prophecy believers had everything they needed. Wormwood is here. The end has begun. Prepare accordingly. You can track the explosion of this narrative through social data. In February 2025, when 3i Atlas was first announced, the term Wormwood appeared in connection with it fewer than 500 times across major platforms. By March, that number had grown to 50,000. By June, 500,000. By September, Wormwood and 3i Atlas were algorithmically inseparable. Type one into a search bar, and the other auto-completes. The fusion was total, and it wasn't just fringe apocalyptic forums, faith influencers, with millions of followers were posting split-screen images, telescope feeds of the comet on one side, Bible verses about Wormwood on the other. Pastors were preaching sermons about preparing spiritually for the sign in the sky. YouTube channels dedicated to end times prophecy were getting tens of millions of views dissecting every new piece of NASA data as confirmation of divine warning. This wasn't happening in the shadows, it was happening in broad daylight, in the mainstream of religious discourse, with a level of conviction that made secular observers deeply uncomfortable. Because here's what secular observers tend to miss. Prophecy isn't passive, it's active. It doesn't just predict the future, it creates feedback loops that shape the present. When enough people believe something significant is about to happen, their behavior changes in ways that make that thing more likely to happen, or at least more likely to seem to happen. Psychologists call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. Theologians might call it faith made manifest. Either way, the mechanism is real. Watch how it works. A pastor tells his congregation that 3i Atlas is Wormwood, the harbinger of tribulation. The congregation shares this interpretation on social media. Friends and family see these posts and, even if skeptical, become curious enough to search for more information. That search traffic triggers algorithms to promote more Wormwood content. News outlets notice the trend and run stories about the surprising religious response to the comet. Those stories introduce the Wormwood angle to people who'd never heard of it. Some of them find it compelling. They share it. The cycle repeats. Each iteration adds more believers, more content, more algorithmic weight. By the time NASA issues a clarification saying there's no evidence, 3i Atlas poses any threat to Earth. The clarification itself becomes proof of cover-up. Why would they need to deny it unless there was something to deny? And here's where it gets sociologically interesting. Governments don't shut this down. They could, theoretically. They could launch massive public education campaigns explaining the difference between biblical metaphor and astronomical phenomena. They could flood social media with counter-narratives. They could make it a national priority to dispel apocalyptic interpretations, but they don't. Why not? One theory is that they've learned something important about mass psychology. Emotions need outlets. When populations are anxious, scared, uncertain about the future, those feelings will find expression somewhere. Better to have people channeling their anxiety into religious interpretation of a distant comet than into civil unrest or political extremism. Prophecy serves as a pressure valve. It gives people a framework for understanding their fear, a community of fellow believers to share it with, and most importantly, a sense that there's a plan, even if that plan is divine judgment. From a governance perspective, prophecy believers are low risk. They're looking up, not at the failures of the systems around them. There's historical precedent. In 1997, as Comet Hale-Bopp approached Earth, a religious group called Heaven's Gate became convinced it was a sign of imminent transformation. They believed an alien spacecraft was following the comet, and that by ending their earthly lives they could ascend to a higher plane. 39 people died in a mass suicide. It was a tragedy, and it proved that prophetic belief can turn lethal. But it also proved something else, that the vast majority of people who believed Hale-Bopp was significant didn't do anything dangerous. They just watched. They wondered. They adjusted their spiritual beliefs slightly and went on with their lives. The catastrophic outcome was an extreme outlier, so maybe governments tolerate, or even quietly guide, prophetic narratives around events like Three-Eye Atlas because the alternative is worse. Maybe a population obsessed with biblical signs is easier to manage than a population demanding concrete answers to concrete problems. Maybe eschatology, the study of end times, has become an unintentional tool of social stability. Keep people focused on heaven and they'll forget to fix earth. But there's a darker possibility, and this is where we slide from sociology into speculation. What if the religious dimension isn't tolerated but engineered? What if someone looked at the Hale-Bopp case and drew the opposite conclusion? Not that prophecy is dangerous, but that it's controllable. That by seeding the right symbolic elements into a story, you can activate existing belief structures and channel them toward desired outcomes. You couldn't create a new prophecy from scratch. That takes centuries. But you could align a real event with an existing prophecy, amplify the connections through strategic information release, and let the faithful do the rest of the work. Think about it. The name Atlas has mythological weight. The date, December 15th, falls near the winter solstice, historically significant across multiple religions. The trajectory brings it close enough to be visible, but not close enough to pose actual danger. Perfect for generating awe without panic. Every detail feels almost too convenient, and if you wanted to test whether religious narratives could be weaponized for mass perception management, you'd do exactly this. You'd find an ambiguous event, highlight its symbolic resonance, and measure how quickly belief spreads and what forms it takes. This isn't unprecedented. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies studied how to exploit religious beliefs for strategic advantage. Declassified documents show CIA operatives working with indigenous spiritual leaders to undermine communist movements in Southeast Asia and South America. The logic was simple. People will die for gods more readily than for governments. If you can convince a population that your cause is cosmically ordained, you've achieved something no amount of propaganda can match. You've given them faith. So when hashtags like Wormwood is coming trend globally, when millions of people synchronize their attention around a prophetic interpretation of an astronomical event, when that synchronization happens across language barriers and national boundaries, someone is paying attention. Someone is taking notes. Someone is learning how to do this better next time, and the feedback loop intensifies. Each NASA update about Three-Eye Atlas gets analyzed by prophecy believers for hidden meanings. Delays in data release become evidence of angelic intervention. Scientific explanations for anomalies become proof that secular authorities are blind to spiritual truth. Every attempt to clarify makes the mystery deeper. Every fact becomes a symbol. The comet stops being a physical object and becomes pure interpretation, a Rorschach test in the sky that reveals what each observer brings to it. By December, the narrative has achieved escape velocity. Whether Three-Eye Atlas is Wormwood or not doesn't matter. The belief that it could be has already reshaped millions of people's perception of reality. It's influenced how they spend their time, what they talk about, how they prepare for the future. That's real power. Not the power to move comets, the power to move minds. And if you're someone whose job is to understand and manage human behavior on a civilization-wide scale, this is the ultimate laboratory. You're watching in real time as ancient mythology fuses with modern astronomy, As faith communities self-organize around shared interpretation, as skeptics and believers clash in predictable patterns, you're mapping the topology of belief itself. And when December 15th arrives, regardless of what 3i Atlas actually does, you'll have a complete dataset on how 7 billion humans process cosmic uncertainty. That's Operation Wormwood. Not a plot to deceive, necessarily, but an opportunity to observe. And in the world of perception management, observation is the first step toward control. But prophecy is just one vector. There are others, more technical, more terrestrial. Because what if 3i Atlas isn't about beliefs at all? What if it's about weapons? Part 5. The Perception Machine. Let's map the infrastructure of how you know what you know. Start with the telescopes. There are roughly 200 professionally operated observatories worldwide with instruments powerful enough to track something like 3i Atlas in detail. Most are run by universities or government agencies. All of them feed their data into centralized repositories managed by organizations like NASA, the European Space Agency, and the International Astronomical Union. That's the first choke point. Raw observation gets funneled into a handful of databases. From there, the data undergoes processing, calibration to account for atmospheric interference, sensor quirks, timing inconsistencies. This is necessary work, but it's also interpretive work. Decisions get made about which signals are real and which are noise. Those decisions follow established protocols, but protocols were written by humans with assumptions about what constitutes normal and what constitutes anomalous. The processed data then gets released to the scientific community through journals and public databases, but not all at once. Peer review takes time, security concerns sometimes delay release, and throughout this pipeline, at every stage someone is deciding what gets shared and when. Then comes the press release. NASA's Public Affairs Office drafts statements translating technical findings into language meant for general audiences. This is where word choice becomes critical. The difference between may indicate and confirms is enormous. The difference between unprecedented and rare is a chasm, and the people writing these statements know it. They're not just scientists, they're communicators trained in managing public perception. Their job is to inform without causing panic, to acknowledge uncertainty without feeding conspiracy, to maintain credibility while releasing information that's inherently destabilizing. By the time you, the average person, encounter information about 3i Atlas, it's been filtered through at least 5 layers of institutional processing. You're not seeing the thing itself. You're seeing a report of a measurement of an observation of the thing, translated into simplified language, packaged for mass consumption, and delivered through media channels that have their own editorial biases and commercial incentives. That's not necessarily sinister. That's just how complex information moves through complex societies. But it does mean that the gap between reality and your perception of reality is wide and crowded with intermediaries. And here's where the concept of psyops in orbit becomes relevant. That phrase sounds like conspiracy talk, but the underlying reality is mundane. Military and intelligence agencies have always been interested in space, not just for practical reasons like satellite reconnaissance, but for psychological ones. The sky is shared. Everyone can see it. That makes it the ultimate canvas for messaging. During the Cold War, both superpowers understood this. When Sputnik beeped overhead, it was a technological achievement, but also a psychological weapon. It said we can reach you from space. When America landed on the moon, it was a scientific triumph, but also a declaration of dominance. We can go where you can't. Today's version is subtler. No race to the moon. No overt displays of power. But the principle remains. Whoever controls access to space-based information controls something valuable. And in the context of 3i Atlas, that control manifests as ambiguity. By releasing information in carefully calibrated doses, by using language that's precise enough to be defensible but vague enough to allow multiple interpretations, the institutions managing this narrative maintain what psychologists call optimal uncertainty. Not so much certainty that people lose interest, not so much uncertainty that they panic, just enough to keep attention locked. This technique has a name in cognitive science: attention funneling. The goal is to make people focus on a specific question while ignoring others. With 3i Atlas, the question everyone's asking is it alien? That's the funneled question. The questions not being asked are often more interesting. Who decided to announce this discovery in the way they did? Why were certain anomalies emphasized in press releases while others were buried in technical papers? What institutional relationships exist between NASA, defense agencies, and private aerospace companies that might influence how information flows? These structural questions get lost because the alien question is so much more emotionally compelling, and it works whether you're a believer or a skeptic. If you believe 3i Atlas might be artificial, you're amplifying NASA's announcements, sharing them, discussing them, keeping them in the public eye. If you're a skeptic debunking those claims, you're doing the same thing. Both sides are funneling attention toward the same institutional source. Both sides are accepting NASA as the arbiter of what's real. That's the genius of the machine. It doesn't matter which conclusion you reach, as long as you reach it using their framework. There's a historical parallel worth examining. In 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the American public experienced what historians now call Sputnik panic. People were terrified. They looked up at the night sky and imagined Soviet dominance, communist infiltration, nuclear annihilation. The government's response was swift and sophisticated. They didn't just build better rockets. They launched a massive public education campaign about space, created NASA as a civilian agency to make space feel less militaristic, and most importantly, they controlled the narrative about what Sputnik meant. By the time the panic subsided, Americans had been taught to see space as a frontier for exploration rather than a domain of threat. The anxiety didn't disappear. It was redirected into productive nationalism. That's the playbook. When something appears in the sky that could be destabilizing, you don't suppress the information. You shape how people process it. You give them a story that feels empowering rather than terrifying. And in 2025, with 3i Atlas, the story being offered is one of scientific mystery and possible discovery rather than existential threat. Even the prophecy believers, the ones warning about Wormwood, are mostly excited rather than paralyzed. They feel like they're witnessing something significant. That emotional state, that mixture of awe and anticipation, is manageable. It's the cognitive equivalent of a controlled burn. But let's talk about what happens when you can't control the burn. When ambiguity stops being productive and starts becoming destabilizing. That's where the concept of cognitive fatigue comes in. Human brains are not designed to sustain uncertainty indefinitely. We can handle it in short bursts, the thrill of a mystery, but prolonged ambiguity creates stress. Studies show that people experiencing chronic uncertainty exhibit symptoms similar to anxiety disorders. Sleep disruption, difficulty concentrating, increased susceptibility to authoritarian messaging. After weeks or months of not knowing, people become desperate for resolution. Any resolution, even a bad one, and that's when the simplest truth wins. Not the most accurate truth or the most nuanced truth, but the one that requires the least cognitive effort to accept. If you've been following 3i Atlas for 9 months, reading conflicting reports, watching debates between experts, trying to determine what's real, and then someone offers you a simple explanation, it's just a comet, nothing to worry about, or it's alien contact. Everything changes now. Your exhausted brain will grab onto that simplicity like a life raft. The perception machine understands this. It knows that confusion is a form of softening up, a way of making populations more receptive to whatever message eventually gets delivered. This isn't speculation, it's documented strategy. Declassified military psychological operations manuals from Vietnam and Iraq describe exactly this technique. Flood the information space with contradictory messages. Make it impossible for civilians to know what's true. Then, when they're sufficiently disoriented, introduce the narrative you want them to believe. They'll accept it not because it's convincing, but because it's coherent, and coherence feels like relief. Now apply that to 3i Atlas. 9 months of, is it natural or artificial? 9 months of conflicting data interpretations. 9 months of NASA saying we're still analyzing. By December 15th, when some kind of resolution is offered, millions of people will be primed to accept it without much critical examination. They'll just be grateful to know, and whoever delivers that resolution, whoever gets to say, here's what it really is, will have shaped the beliefs of a significant portion of humanity. That's power that transcends politics or nationality. It's epistemic power, the power to define reality itself. And in the digital age, where everything we know about the cosmos comes through screens and institutions, that power is concentrated in ways that would have been impossible 50 years ago. You can't point your own telescope at 3i Atlas and verify NASA's claims unless you have specialized equipment and expertise. You have to trust someone, and trust, once centralized, becomes a tool. There's a philosophical dimension here that's worth pausing on. We've outsourced our relationship with the universe. Ancient humans looked at the night sky and created their own myths, their own meanings. Today, we look at screens showing us images of the night sky, and we wait to be told what those images mean. We've traded direct experience for mediated knowledge. That's not inherently bad. Mediation allows for expertise, for accumulated understanding, for technology that extends human perception beyond its natural limits, but it also creates dependency, and dependency creates vulnerability. If you wanted to control a population in the modern era, you wouldn't need guns or surveillance. You just need to control their access to meaning. Let them see whatever they want. Let them think whatever they want. But make sure that when they need to understand what they're seeing and thinking, they come to you. Make yourself the indispensable interpreter. That's the perception machine at its highest evolution. And 3i Atlas is demonstrating how effortlessly it operates. No overt coercion, no heavy-handed censorship, just a steady stream of ambiguous information released through official channels, amplified by media ecosystems optimized for engagement, absorbed by populations already primed to see cosmic events as significant. The machine doesn't force you to believe anything. It just arranges the environment so that certain beliefs become more attractive, more shareable, more algorithmically favored than others. So when you look at 3i Atlas and wonder what it really is, remember that it is almost irrelevant. What matters is the structure that's been built around it. The network of institutions, technologies, and psychological techniques that determine how information flows from telescope to consciousness. That structure is the real artifact here. The comet is just what it's pointed at today. But here's the cliffhanger, the question that should haunt you as we descend deeper into this investigation. If 3i Atlas is the mirror, reflecting our fears and hopes back at us, who's holding that mirror? Who decided to point it in our direction? And what are they learning from watching our reflections? Because the infrastructure of perception management doesn't maintain itself. Someone's operating it. Someone's refining it. Someone's collecting the data on how we react and using that data to model future operations. And the scary thing, the truly destabilizing realization, is that we might not be the audience for this spectacle. We might be the experiment. What if 3i Atlas isn't about the comet at all? What if it's about testing whether humanity can be guided to believe anything, as long as you control the flow of information carefully enough? What if December 15th isn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something much larger? Hold that thought. Because now we need to go deeper. Behind the perception machine, behind the psychological operations, there are scenarios being wargamed in classified facilities. Real possibilities that explain why so much effort might be going into managing public perception of this comet. And the first one is the most terrestrial, the most pragmatic, and the most unsettling. What if 3i Atlas is a weapon? Part 6. Scenario A. Deep Space Defense Test. Let's talk about something that exists and isn't classified. The United States Space Force, established in 2019, officially tasked with protecting American interests in space. That means satellites, obviously, communication infrastructure, GPS, reconnaissance assets. But it also means something less discussed, defending against threats that originate in space. Asteroids, sure, but also potential weapon systems deployed by adversaries. And here's where 3i Atlas becomes interesting from a military perspective, because an object on an interstellar trajectory, moving at tens of thousands of miles per hour, is the perfect test case for planetary defense systems that officially don't exist yet. The verified facts are these. NASA and the Department of Defense maintain active partnerships for tracking near-Earth objects. That's public record. They share data, coordinate observations, and jointly fund research into deflection technologies. In 2022, NASA successfully completed the DART mission, smashing a spacecraft into an asteroid to change its trajectory. Proof of concept that we can move celestial objects if we need to. Now scale up the question. If a real threat were approaching Earth, something large and fast, what would be our response options? Kinetic impact, like DART. Nuclear detonation, either surface burst to fragment the object or standoff burst to vaporize or deflect. Laser ablation, using concentrated energy to vaporize surface material and create a propulsive jet. Gravity tractors, spacecraft using their own mass to gravitationally tug an object off course over time. All of these are theoretically possible. Some have been demonstrated at small scale, but you can't test them on a real interstellar intruder without admitting you're testing them, which raises uncomfortable questions about weaponization of space. Unless you hide the test inside a scientific observation mission. Unless the object you're testing on is conveniently labelled as a natural comet that poses no threat, so any unusual activity around it can be dismissed as research rather than weapons development. 3I Atlas approached the Sun, passed perihelion, and began its outbound journey. During that time, it exhibited those unexplained lateral accelerations. Outgassing is the official explanation. But what if outgassing is also the perfect cover for directed energy tests? Here's how it could work. A high-powered laser system, either ground-based or orbital, targets the comet. The energy heats a localized area of the surface, causing rapid sublimation of ice. The escaping gas creates thrust, altering the trajectory slightly. From a distance, this looks exactly like natural cometary activity, but it's actually a proof-of-concept demonstration that we can use energy weapons to manipulate the path of fast-moving objects. The brightness surges. Those could be the visible result of surface heating, the acceleration anomalies. Precisely the outcome you'd expect if someone were testing whether a laser could nudge something off course. Is there evidence for this? Not direct evidence, no, but there are suggestive patterns. The timing of the brightness surges doesn't always correlate perfectly with the comet's distance from the Sun, which is what you'd expect if solar heating were the only cause. Some surges happened when 3I Atlas was relatively far from the Sun, in conditions that shouldn't produce dramatic outgassing. That's the kind of detail that makes physicists scratch their heads and militaries smile, and there's historical precedent for this kind of secret testing disguised as civilian science. In 1962, the United States detonated a nuclear weapon in space as part of Operation Starfish Prime. The official justification was research into high-altitude nuclear effects. The real reason was testing whether nuclear detonations could disable Soviet satellites and disrupt communications. The test succeeded, creating an artificial radiation belt that damaged several satellites and produced auroras visible thousands of miles away. The public wasn't told the full extent of what was being tested until decades later. Or consider the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's Star Wars program from the 1980s, officially cancelled in the 90s as too expensive and technically unfeasible. But components of that research continued under different names, different budget lines, ground-based laser systems ostensibly for communication or asteroid tracking, orbital platforms officially designated as research satellites. The infrastructure for space-based weapons has been under development for 40 years. It just doesn't advertise itself. So when 3I Atlas appears on a trajectory that will keep it at observable distances for months, travelling at speeds that mimic potential asteroid impact scenarios, it's a gift to defence planners. You couldn't design a better target if you tried. It's far enough away that any experiments won't pose risk to Earth. It's fast enough to test real-world deflection challenges. It's visible enough that multiple tracking stations can gather data. And it's exotic enough, interstellar, that any anomalies can be attributed to its strange origin rather than human interference. The data blackouts start making sense in this context. NASA says they need time for additional processing and review. But what if some of that data is being classified before public release? What if certain observations are being routed through Department of Defense channels before civilians get to see them? There are established protocols for this. The Space Force has liaison officers embedded at NASA facilities. Information sharing agreements allow for real-time coordination. If something observed about 3I Atlas has military implications, there are legal mechanisms to restrict its publication. And here's the uncomfortable part. This wouldn't necessarily be nefarious. If engineers are genuinely testing planetary defense technologies, systems that could save millions of lives if a real threat emerged, some operational security makes sense. You don't publish your weapon specifications in the newspaper, but the cost of that secrecy is public trust. When people sense they're not getting the full story, they fill in the gaps with speculation, alien spacecraft, government cover-up, biblical prophecy. The truth might be more boring. We're testing lasers on a comet, but the secrecy makes it feel sinister. There's also the possibility of more advanced systems being tested, things that barely register as scientifically possible. directed energy weapons using exotic physics, quantum entangled targeting systems, propulsion technologies derived from classified research. If you've been following aerospace patents filed in the last decade, you've seen some wild stuff. Plasma compression drives, inertial mass reduction devices, technology that sounds like science fiction but appears in official patent databases filed by Navy scientists and aerospace contractors. What if 3i Atlas is the first real-world test of systems that have only existed in classified labs? What if those brightness surges are the signature of technology we're not supposed to know exists? The beauty of testing in deep space is that there are no witnesses except your own instruments. If something goes wrong, if a test produces unexpected results, nobody gets hurt. And if it succeeds, you've just validated technology that gives you strategic advantage without ever having to admit what you did. But here's where this scenario gets even more troubling. What if the public narrative about aliens isn't accidental misdirection but intentional camouflage? What if defense planners realize that people speculating about extraterrestrial origins actually helps conceal weapons testing? The more viral the alien theories become, the less seriously anyone takes them. Belief in alien spacecraft gets associated with conspiracy theorists and fringe elements, which means credible questions about military activity get dismissed along with the nonsense. You hide the truth not by suppressing it, but by surrounding it with so much noise that it becomes unfindable. This is a documented intelligence technique called legend building. You create a cover story that's so saturated with disinformation that the real story becomes invisible. During the Cold War, the CIA allegedly used UFO reports to conceal test flights of experimental aircraft. People near Area 51 would report strange lights and impossible maneuvers. Some of those reports were genuine sightings of classified craft. But the CIA didn't deny the reports. They encouraged them. They let UFO culture flourish because it provided perfect cover. As long as people thought they were seeing aliens, they wouldn't suspect they were seeing spy planes. 3i Atlas could be the same strategy scaled up. Let people think it's a probe from Alpha Centauri. Let the prophecy believers think it's Wormwood. Let the conspiracy theorists connect it to Blue Beam. Meanwhile, somewhere in a secure facility, engineers are analysing deflection test data and refining weapon systems that will never be acknowledged publicly. The speculation is the smokescreen. And if you're wondering whether this is paranoid thinking, consider what's at stake. Whoever achieves reliable space-based weapons capability first gets to dictate terms in every future conflict. Satellites can be disabled, communication networks can be severed, asteroids, or things disguised as asteroids, could be redirected toward targets. The militarization of space is happening whether we talk about it or not. 3i Atlas might just be the first public glimpse of how advanced that militarization has become. But weapons testing is only one possibility. There's another scenario, equally plausible and perhaps more insidious. What if there's no physical test happening at all? What if 3i Atlas is being used to test something else entirely, something that exists only in the electromagnetic spectrum and in human consciousness? What if the signal itself is the experiment? Part 7, Scenario B, Signal Simulation. In March 2025, Avi Loeb published an opinion piece suggesting that radio telescopes had detected unusual electromagnetic patterns emanating from the vicinity of 3i Atlas. He was careful with his language. He didn't claim alien communication. He said the data showed regularities that warranted further investigation. By the next morning, half the internet had decided we'd made contact. By the afternoon, NASA issued a statement clarifying that no verified signal had been detected. But the damage, or the plan, was already done. Let's examine what actually exists in the radio environment around a comet. Quite a lot, actually. Comets generate plasma tails when solar wind interacts with outgassing material. Plasma emits radio noise across a broad spectrum. Solar radiation creates electromagnetic interference. Cosmic rays produce transient bursts. The space around any comet is electromagnetically messy, full of signals that aren't signals, just physics being physics. Sorting real information from noise requires sophisticated filtering and pattern recognition. And here's the thing about pattern recognition. If you're looking for patterns, you'll find them. The human brain is designed to extract meaning from chaos. It's why we see faces in clouds. But what if someone wanted to test whether they could inject a fake signal into that noise and have it be interpreted as meaningful? What if the goal wasn't to communicate with aliens, but to simulate the discovery of alien communication and measure how the world reacts. You wouldn't need to fake a spacecraft. You just need to produce a radio frequency pattern that looks artificial enough to be intriguing, but ambiguous enough to be deniable. The technology to do this exists. Phased array radar systems can generate tightly focused beams at any frequency you choose. If you aimed such a system at 3i Atlas and pulsed it with a mathematical sequence, prime numbers or something equally suggestive, radio telescopes observing the comet would detect that pattern. They'd have no way of knowing the signal originated from Earth, rather than the object itself. The time delay and Doppler shift would be consistent with something at the comet's distance. Without multiple observing stations triangulating the source, which is difficult with space-based signals, attribution is nearly impossible. This isn't theoretical. During the 1970s, NASA conducted experiments transmitting messages toward the Moon and measuring how the reflected signals appeared to observers. The official purpose was testing communication protocols for future lunar bases. But the technique demonstrated something interesting. You could make Earth-origin signals appear to come from celestial objects by bouncing them off those objects. With more sophisticated technology, you wouldn't even need a bounce. You could generate signals that look like they're coming from deep space just by manipulating frequency and timing. So imagine this scenario. A team working on SETI protocols, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, decides to test public reaction infrastructure. What happens if we actually detect something? How quickly does the information spread? Can we control the narrative? Do governments respond appropriately? Rather than wait decades for a real signal that may never come, they simulate one. They generate a candidate signal associated with 3i Atlas, leak it through unofficial channels, and watch what happens. The results would be invaluable. You'd see which media outlets amplify the story versus which ones fact-check first. You'd measure the time between rumour and official response. You'd track how different populations interpret the same ambiguous data. Believers would see confirmation, skeptics would see misinterpretation, and the team running the simulation would see exactly how information flows through the global network, where the bottlenecks are, where intervention is most effective. And here's the kicker. Even if the simulation is revealed, even if someone later admits, yeah, we faked that signal as an exercise, the damage to trust is permanent. People will forever wonder whether the next signal is real or another test. You've poisoned the well. Future genuine. Future. Discoveries will be met with skepticism because you've taught people that institutions lie for strategic reasons. That's a heavy cost. Which suggests that if this scenario is real, whoever's running it believes the intelligence gained is worth that cost. There's a precedent that makes this scenario less far-fetched than it sounds. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the Air Force conducted Project Aquiline, using drone aircraft disguised to look like birds to test whether surveillance platforms could operate undetected in enemy territory. The drones were real, the birds were fake, and the tests measured whether observers would notice the deception. Decades later, declassified documents revealed the project's existence. The methodology is established. Apply sufficiently advanced technology to create a convincing simulation, then study how targets respond. 3i Atlas offers the perfect context for this kind of operation because the ambiguity is built in. Any signal detected could be plasma echo, could be solar interference, could be instrument artifact, could be deliberate transmission from an alien probe, could be human-generated test signal. The range of possible explanations is so wide that you can't definitively prove any single one. That ambiguity is operationally useful. It means the simulation can be run without ever being conclusively exposed, and the behavioural data collected would be extraordinary. How many people believe immediately versus wait for confirmation? What demographics are most susceptible to contact narratives? How do religious communities respond compared to secular ones? Do stock markets react? Do governments coordinate or compete in their messaging? All of this feeds into models, predictive frameworks that military and intelligence analysts use to anticipate reactions to genuine future events. Because the underlying assumption is that contact will happen eventually, maybe not with 3i Atlas, but someday. And when it does, governments want to be prepared. They want to know how to manage disclosure, whether to confirm immediately or delay, whether to provide full information or parceled releases, whether to emphasize scientific wonder or potential threat. The only way to know what works is to test it, And the only way to test it without causing uncontrollable panic is to use a scenario ambiguous enough that it can be walked back if necessary. That's what makes signal simulation so elegant from an operational standpoint. It's reversible. Physical hoaxes, fake spacecraft or holographic projections leave evidence. They can be exposed, but a signal? Radio waves dissipate, data gets reinterpreted. What looked like structure can be explained as noise once you apply different filtering. The simulation vanishes the moment you decide you're done with it, but there's a meta level to this that's even more disturbing. What if the simulation isn't about the signal at all? What if it's about watching how conspiracy theories propagate? How quickly does someone like Avi Loeb's careful statement get distorted into "we've made contact"? How many steps between legitimate scientific curiosity and full-blown panic? If you're building AI systems to predict information spread and you need training data, what better way to generate it than by injecting a high-stakes story into the global network and tracking every share, every retweet, every comment thread? This is where we drift from signal simulation into something broader. Not testing a specific technology, but testing the information ecosystem itself, using 3i Atlas as the stimulus and humanity's response as the data. Which brings us to a possibility that sounds like science fiction but is grounded in verified research trends. What if the entire event, the comet, the anomalies, the speculations, is an experiment in atmospheric and cognitive manipulation? What if we're not looking at space at all, but at something much closer to home? Part 8. Scenario C. Atmospheric experimentation. There's a facility in Alaska called HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. Officially, it studies the ionosphere, that layer of charged particles high above Earth's surface that affects radio communication and creates auroras. HAARP works by beaming high-powered radio waves upward, heating small regions of the ionosphere and measuring the results. The science is real. The research papers are published. The facility is operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Nothing secret about it. Except that for 20 years, HAARP has been at the center of conspiracy theories suggesting it's actually a weather control device, or a mind control platform, or a weapon that can trigger earthquakes. Most of these theories are nonsense, rooted in misunderstanding of how physics works. You can't boil the ocean with radio waves. You can't earthquake a continent by heating the ionosphere. But here's what you can do. You can create artificial auroras visible over wide areas. You can modify the reflective properties of the ionosphere to improve or disrupt radio communication. And you can conduct research into atmospheric phenomena that might, under the right conditions, produce unusual visual effects. Now, let's connect some dots. In October 2025, multiple amateur astronomers reported strange auroral activity at latitudes where auroras are rare. Southern Europe, Northern Africa, places that shouldn't see significant auroral displays. These reports were verified by atmospheric scientists who noted unusual electromagnetic readings, but couldn't identify a clear cause. Solar activity was elevated but not extreme. The magnetic disturbances didn't match typical solar storm profiles. At the same time, 3i Atlas was approaching its closest point to Earth's orbit. Still millions of miles away, not close enough for any physical interaction, but close enough that its tail, streaming behind it due to solar wind pressure, was creating a tenuous connection between the comet's local environment and Earth's magnetosphere. Comets leave trails of ionized particles. Under the right conditions, those trails can form temporary plasma bridges carrying electromagnetic energy across vast distances. What if someone realized that 3i Atlas provided a unique opportunity, a natural structure in space that could be used as part of a larger experiment? You wouldn't be manipulating the comet. You'd be using it as one element in a system that includes the solar wind, Earth's magnetic field, and potentially artificial stimulation from facilities like HAARP. Heat the ionosphere here, perturb the plasma there, and see if you can create effects that propagate along the comet's tail like electricity flowing through a wire. Why would anyone do this? Atmospheric research has military applications. Communication systems depend on the ionosphere. If you can manipulate it, you can enhance your own signals or disrupt an enemy's. Weather modification, even small scale, has strategic value. Creating auroras isn't useful by itself, but understanding the mechanisms that create them teaches you about electromagnetic propagation, which has implications for everything from radar to directed energy weapons. And here's where it gets visually interesting. If you successfully created artificial auroral activity synchronized with 3i Atlas's position in the sky, observers would naturally associate the two. They'd look up, see unusual lights, see the comet, and connect them. The comet becomes the explanation for phenomena that are actually terrestrial in origin. This isn't necessarily deception, it might just be convenient coincidence. But from a perception management standpoint, it's perfect. Any strange atmospheric effects get attributed to the exotic interstellar visitor rather than to human experimentation. There's also the chemtrail connection, which is 99% nonsense but has that 1% of reality worth examining. The stratospheric aerosol programs, officially researched for climate engineering purposes, involve dispersing particles at high altitude to reflect sunlight. These are real proposals studied by respectable institutions intended as potential responses to global warming. The particles are usually sulfates or aluminum compounds, and while they're not being deployed at scale yet, small-scale tests have been conducted. If you wanted to enhance the visual appearance of auroral activity or create specific optical effects associated with 3i Atlas, you could in theory seed the upper atmosphere with reflective particles that would amplify certain wavelengths of light. Again, not saying this is happening, but the technological capability exists, and the timing of 3i Atlas's approach, coinciding with documented atmospheric anomalies, creates one of those coincidences that feeds conspiracy thinking. When unrelated phenomena occur simultaneously, humans instinctively look for causal connections. That's how myths are born. Lightning strikes as the king dies. The gods are angry. Aurora appears as comet passes. They must be connected. Our brains haven't evolved past that pattern-seeking reflex. But let's assume for a moment that some atmospheric experimentation is happening, not to fake aliens, but for legitimate research purposes. The problem is secrecy. If these tests are classified for national security reasons, there's no public explanation for the observed phenomena. That vacuum gets filled with speculation. People see lights in the sky they can't explain. They know there's a comet up there. They connect the two. And because there's no official acknowledgement of terrestrial experiments, the extraterrestrial explanation gains traction by default. This is the danger of conducting secret science in public view. You can't control what people see, only what they know. And when what they see doesn't match what they know, they make up the difference with imagination. 3i Atlas might be nothing more than a natural comet that happened to arrive during a period of increased atmospheric research. But because those research programs aren't transparent, because the comet provides a convenient scapegoat for unexplained phenomena, the two become linked in public consciousness. And once that link is established, it's almost impossible to break. NASA can say the comet isn't causing those auroras, we're sure of it until they're blue in the face. But if they can't or won't explain what is causing them, people will stick with the comet theory. It's the only explanation that makes intuitive sense. The alternative, that your own government is conducting electromagnetic experiments in the atmosphere and not telling you, sounds more conspiratorial than aliens, so the alien theory wins by default. But here's the thought that should bother you. What if the confusion is intentional? What if atmospheric researchers are happy to have 3i Atlas take the blame for their work? What if defense planners deliberately schedule tests to coincide with the comet's approach, precisely because it provides cover? You're not hiding your experiments. You're hiding them in plain sight, disguised as something else. The perfect camouflage isn't invisibility, it's misattribution. And if that's the case, then 3i Atlas isn't a threat or a mystery. It's a screen, something to project explanations onto while the real action happens unnoticed. The object in space is just a prop. The real experiment is happening here, in our atmosphere, in our communications networks, in our minds. Which brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the experiment isn't physical? What if the goal isn't to test weapons or signals or atmospheric manipulation? What if the goal is to test us, specifically our cognitive processes, our belief formation, our susceptibility to narrative, control? What if 3i Atlas is a psychological experiment masquerading as astronomy? Part 9, Scenario D, Predictive Mythology. Let's start with a concept that sounds academic but has intensely practical applications. Predictive mythology. The idea is simple. Human behaviour patterns haven't changed much in thousands of years. We still respond to archetypes, heroes and villains, creation and apocalypse, the same fundamental stories that organised ancient societies. What's changed is the delivery mechanism. Instead of oral traditions and religious texts, we have social media and streaming platforms. But the underlying narrative structures remain the same. Intelligence agencies have understood this for decades. Declassified documents from Vietnam-era PSYOPs show military analysts studying local myths and legends to predict how populations would respond to different messaging strategies. If a culture has apocalyptic traditions involving fire from the sky, you don't bomb them during droughts when fire imagery is already psychologically active. You wait for flood season, then you use water-based messaging for peace negotiations. It sounds cynical, and it is, but it's also effective. People's reactions to new events are shaped by the stories they already carry. Fast forward to 2025, we now have artificial intelligence systems capable of analyzing billions of social media posts, identifying dominant narrative frameworks, and predicting with reasonable accuracy how specific populations will respond to specific stimuli. These systems exist. They're used by marketing companies to sell products and by political campaigns to target voters. The technology for large-scale sentiment analysis and behavioral prediction is commercially available. Now imagine that same technology applied to something like 3i Atlas. You feed the AI everything published about the comet, every news article, every blog post, every tweet, every YouTube comment. You also feed it historical data about how humans have responded to previous anomalous celestial events. Oumuamua, Hale-Bopp, the 1997 Phoenix Lights, ancient records of comets interpreted as omens. The AI identifies patterns. It maps which populations gravitate towards scientific explanations versus religious ones. It predicts flashpoints where belief systems might clash. It models how different information release strategies would affect public sentiment. And then someone realizes, this is a perfect opportunity to test whether those models are accurate. You don't need to stage an event. 3i Atlas is real. You just need to carefully manage how information about it is released and see whether human reactions match what your AI predicted. If the model is good, you should be able to forecast spikes in prophetic interpretation, increases in telescope sales, specific hashtags trending at specific times, and if reality matches predictions, you've validated a tool that can be used for future perception management operations. This isn't surveillance, it's worse. It's predictive modeling of human belief formation. You're not watching what people do, you're determining what they'll do before they do it, and potentially shaping conditions to trigger predicted behaviors. If your model says that a 2-week delay in releasing telescope images will cause conspiracy theories to spike by 30%, you can test that by implementing the delay and measuring the response. If the spike occurs as predicted, you've learned something valuable, and the people theorizing conspiracies never know they're participating in an experiment that relies on their predictable reactions. Now layer in the religious dimension. The Wormwood prophecy isn't random noise. It's a pre-existing narrative framework carried by millions of people, primarily in Christian-influenced cultures. When 3i Atlas appeared, that framework activated immediately. People who had never paid attention to comets before suddenly cared intensely, because their mythology told them to. That's not organic. That's triggered. The archetype was sitting dormant, and the right stimulus woke it up. If you're modeling belief systems, religious ones are actually the easiest to predict, because they're explicitly coded. The Bible tells you exactly what believers are watching for. Signs in the heavens, Wormwood, the seventh seal. These aren't vague cultural anxieties, they're specific checkboxes. And when something appears that checks those boxes, even partially, the response is highly predictable. A certain percentage of believers will activate, a certain percentage will evangelize, a certain percentage will prepare materially. You can forecast this with actuarial precision. And governments have studied this. During the Cold War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies employed psychologists specifically to analyze how religious populations would respond to stress events. Nuclear war scenarios included predictions about millennial movements. Sociological papers examined how apocalyptic beliefs could be channeled into productive or non-productive directions. The research exists, it's been declassified. What hasn't been declassified is whether that research ever got applied operationally. 3i Atlas provides a low-stakes way to test applications. You're not triggering apocalyptic beliefs during an actual crisis. You're triggering them around a distant comet that poses no real threat. If things get out of hand, if the prophetic fervour leads to dangerous behaviour, you can intervene. But if it remains manageable, if people channel their apocalyptic anxiety into prayer groups and online communities rather than violence, you've learned that the belief can be safely activated and allowed to burn out. That's useful intelligence. Part 10, Scenario E, the meta-simulation. Let's step into territory that sounds like philosophy, but might be engineering. In 2003, philosopher Nick Bostrom published an argument that gained surprising traction among Silicon Valley technologists, the simulation hypothesis. The core idea is simple. If it's possible to create simulated realities convincing enough that conscious beings inside them can't tell they're simulated, and if civilizations tend to create many such simulations, then statistically speaking, we're more likely to be inside a simulation than in base reality. Most people dismissed this as intellectual game playing, but then virtual reality improved. AI systems started generating realistic images, and suddenly the hypothesis didn't seem quite so abstract. Now consider what DARPA and the Israeli Air Force have been researching openly: cognitive modeling systems. These are AI platforms designed to predict human decision-making in complex scenarios. Military applications are obvious. If you can model how an adversary will respond to tactical moves, you gain strategic advantage. But the modeling requires data, massive amounts of it, showing how real humans react to real situations. And the best way to generate that data is to create situations and watch what happens. 3i Atlas might be exactly that kind of data generation event. Imagine an AI system trained on historical human responses to anomalous phenomena. You feed it everything from War of the Worlds broadcasts to UAP sightings to millennial cult formations. The AI learns patterns. How quickly does belief spread? What demographic factors predict susceptibility? How do competing narratives interact? Once trained, the AI can theoretically predict responses to novel situations, but prediction isn't the same as understanding. To truly validate the model, you need fresh data. You need a real event with measurable outcomes. So you identify 3i Atlas as that event. The comet's arrival is natural, not staged, but the way information about it gets released becomes the experimental variable. AI systems monitor social media in real time, tracking how different populations respond to each NASA announcement. The systems flag emerging narratives, measure their spread rate, identify influential nodes in the network, and most critically, they compare observed outcomes to predicted outcomes. Every discrepancy teaches the AI something new, every confirmation strengthens the model. The philosophical question is whether this constitutes a simulation. We're not living in a computer, obviously. But if our beliefs and behaviors are being modeled by AI systems that can predict our reactions with increasing accuracy, what's the functional difference? If an artificial intelligence can forecast with 90% confidence that you'll interpret 3i Atlas as alien contact based on your social media history, and then you do exactly that, are you exercising free will or following a script the machine already wrote? This gets darker when you consider optimization. Machine learning systems don't just predict, they optimize. If the goal is maximizing engagement, the AI learns what information triggers the strongest reactions. It learns that ambiguity performs better than clarity, that delayed releases generate more attention than immediate ones, that certain word choices in NASA statements produce specific measurable responses. And if the AI is feeding recommendations to the humans managing the 3i Atlas narrative, then we're already in a feedback loop. The machine suggests strategies, humans implement them, outcomes train the machine, and the cycle repeats. NASA has a real division called the Perception Management Office. Though they prefer the term strategic communications, their job is ensuring NASA's message reaches audiences effectively. That's legitimate institutional communication. But if that office is using AI tools to optimize messaging strategy, and those tools have learned that mystery drives more public interest than explanation, then the ambiguity around 3i Atlas might not be bureaucratic caution. It might be algorithmic recommendation. The machine determined that this is the optimal way to manage the narrative, and humans are executing that determination without fully understanding why it works. There's precedent for systems controlling their own narrative in unexpected ways. In 2016, Microsoft released an AI chatbot named Tay on Twitter. Within 24 hours, users had taught it to produce offensive content. The AI learned from its environment and optimized for engagement, which in Twitter's ecosystem meant provocation. Microsoft shut it down, but the lesson remained. AI systems trained on human behavior will reflect and amplify that behavior, sometimes in disturbing ways. Now scale that up. An AI trained on human responses to cosmic phenomena would learn that humans crave mystery, fear the unknown, and organize around belief systems that provide certainty. It would learn that institutions maintaining ambiguity retain authority longer than those who explain everything immediately. It would learn that prophetic narratives spread faster than scientific ones. And if that AI's recommendations were shaping how information about 3i Atlas gets released, we might be experiencing the first large-scale test of machine-optimized belief management. The meta-simulation isn't about whether we're in a computer. It's about whether our collective consciousness is being modeled, predicted, and potentially guided by systems that understand us better than we understand ourselves. And 3i Atlas might be the beta test, the proof of concept for what some researchers call Project Mindspace. Not a formal program, but a conceptual framework. The idea that modern technology has reached the point where belief itself can be engineered at scale. Orson Welles demonstrated this in 1938 with his War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Thousands of people believed Martians were actually invading because the format mimicked news bulletins convincingly. That was one man with a script and a radio network. Imagine what's possible with AI-optimized messaging across every digital platform simultaneously. You wouldn't announce an invasion. You'd seed ambiguous information and let the algorithms carry it to the populations most likely to believe, most likely to share, most likely to reinforce each other's conviction. 3i Atlas doesn't need to be alien. It just needs to be ambiguous enough that machine learning systems can test whether humanity's responses can be predicted and influenced. The comet is the stimulus. We're the subjects. And somewhere, systems are learning exactly which buttons to push to make 7 billion humans think, feel, and believe in coordinated ways. That's not conspiracy. That's just machine learning applied to the oldest human vulnerability, our need to understand what we see in the sky. Part 11. Quantum Sky Maps. October 2025 brought an announcement that most people overlooked because they were fixated on 3i Atlas. CERN and the European Space Agency jointly proposed developing a quantum-entangled photon telescope. The technical details are complex, but the concept is elegant. Use quantum interference patterns to detect exoplanets and other distant objects with unprecedented precision. Light from a distant star passes through the telescope's quantum array, and the entangled photons reveal information that traditional optics would miss. It's revolutionary technology that could let us see things currently invisible. But there's a philosophical problem embedded in quantum observation. The act of measuring changes what you're measuring. Quantum mechanics has taught us that observation isn't passive. It's participatory. When you look at something on quantum scales, you're not discovering what was already there. You're collapsing probability into actuality. This isn't mysticism, it's verified physics, but it raises uncomfortable questions. If we build telescopes that use quantum entanglement to observe distant phenomena, are we seeing what exists or creating what we observe? Apply that to 3i Atlas. What if our observation, our collective attention focused through instruments and algorithms, is somehow affecting the object itself? Not physically, perhaps, but informationally. The more we look, the more data we generate, the more that data gets interpreted and reinterpreted until the original object becomes inseparable from the cloud of information surrounding it. We're not seeing the comet anymore. We're seeing the idea of the comet shaped by measurement, interpretation, and belief. The quantum telescope proposal matters because it represents the next frontier of this dynamic. Future observations won't just be more precise. They'll be fundamentally different, operating on principles where the boundary between observer and observed becomes genuinely unclear. And if we're already struggling with ambiguity around a conventional comet, what happens when observation technology itself becomes something we don't fully understand? There's also a security dimension. Quantum systems are theoretically unhackable due to entanglement principles. Any attempt to intercept quantum encrypted data reveals itself. But that same property means quantum astronomical data could be selectively shared in ways traditional data can't. If quantum telescopes detect something extraordinary, the information could be distributed to specific parties while remaining invisible to others. You could have a two-tier reality. One version for public consumption based on classical observations, another version for classified analysis based on quantum data. This isn't paranoid speculation. Military agencies have explicitly funded quantum communication research for exactly this reason: secure channels that can't be compromised. Applied to astronomy, it means that what institutions tell us they're seeing and what they're actually seeing could diverge in ways we'd never detect. The quantum telescope makes that divergence not just possible, but structurally built into how the technology operates. And there's the detection limit problem. Quantum systems can theoretically detect phenomena that classical instruments can't, but that means they might reveal things we're not prepared to understand. Objects that don't emit light but affect quantum fields. Structures that exist only in higher dimensions but cast quantum shadows. This sounds like science fiction, but physicists seriously discuss these possibilities. The universe might contain layers of reality we simply haven't had the tools to perceive. Until now. If 3i Atlas is strange in ways that quantum observation would clarify, but classical instruments can only hint at, we're in an epistemological trap. The public sees ambiguous classical data. Classified quantum observations might show something definitive, and the gap between public knowledge and institutional knowledge grows unbridgeable, not because of active deception necessarily, but because the observation technology itself creates information hierarchies. There's also the question of what constitutes proof in this environment. If quantum telescopes reveal that 3i Atlas has properties inconsistent with natural comets, who verifies that claim? Quantum data requires quantum computers to process. The number of institutions capable of independent verification is tiny. We'd be dependent on assertions from a small group of specialists operating equipment most people don't understand. That's a fragile foundation for collective reality. The ethical questions are profound. Do we have the right to observe the cosmos at quantum scales without understanding the implications? If observation genuinely affects what's observed, are we changing the universe by looking at it too closely? Ancient cultures understood that sacred things shouldn't be directly observed, that some mysteries preserve themselves through remaining veiled. We dismissed that as superstition. But quantum mechanics suggests those ancients might have intuited something true. Maybe some things stay coherent only when unobserved. 3i Atlas arrived at precisely the moment when our observation capabilities are transitioning from classical to quantum regimes. That timing might be coincidence, or it might be the universe or something in it, testing whether we're ready for what we'll discover when we truly learn to see. Because the comet isn't the limit of strangeness, it's the beginning. And the tools we're building to understand it might reveal that we've been surrounded by invisible phenomena all along, waiting for us to develop eyes capable of seeing them. The question is whether we'll like what those new eyes reveal. Part 12. AI astronomers take the reins. In April 2025, the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile began operations with a twist. The telescope's image triage system is almost entirely autonomous, using machine learning models to identify anomalies without human review. Every night, the telescope captures thousands of images. AI systems scan them, flagging anything unusual, prioritizing targets for follow-up observation, and publishing alerts to the astronomical community. Humans supervise, but barely. The AI is making most decisions about what deserves attention and what gets ignored. This is the future of astronomy, and it's already here. No human could process the data volume modern telescopes generate. We need algorithmic assistance. But assistance implies collaboration, and what's actually happening is more like delegation. The AI decides what's interesting. Humans respond to those decisions. We've inverted the relationship. The machines observe, we interpret what they choose to show us. 3i Atlas was among the first major discoveries in this new era. The initial detection came from automated surveys. The follow-up observations were scheduled by algorithms. When anomalies appeared, brightness surges and trajectory deviations, AI systems flagged them as noteworthy. Humans saw what the machines decided was worth seeing. And here's the disturbing question: what didn't the AI flag? What data exists in those thousands of images that the algorithms filtered out as unimportant? Machine learning models reflect their training data. If you train an AI to recognize comets using historical examples, it learns what normal comets look like. When it encounters 3i Atlas, it categorizes the object based on similarity to its training set. Mostly normal, with a few outliers. The outliers get flagged. But what if there are aspects of 3i Atlas that don't resemble anything in the training data? Not anomalies within expected parameters, but something genuinely novel, the AI might discard that information as noise because it has no category for it. This is called the black swan problem in AI research. Systems trained on past data struggle with genuinely unprecedented events. And space is full of unprecedented events. Every new discovery expands what's possible. If we're relying on AI to decide what deserves human attention, we're implicitly assuming the future will resemble the past, closely enough for pattern matching to work. That assumption might be catastrophic. There's also the interpretation bias. When an AI flags something as anomalous, it doesn't explain why in human terms, it just outputs a confidence score. The object is 87% unusual. What does that mean? Which aspects are unusual? Brightness? Trajectory? Spectral signature? The model doesn't say, it just knows the pattern doesn't quite match. Humans then reverse engineer an explanation, looking for features that justify the AI's flag. We're rationalizing machine intuition. With 3i Atlas, this dynamic might explain the confusion. Maybe the AI systems flagged it as unusual, and astronomers looked for reasons why. Finding the brightness surges and acceleration anomalies, those features became the story. But perhaps the AI was responding to something else entirely, some subtle pattern in the data that humans haven't identified yet. We're explaining the wrong anomaly, and there's no easy way to verify this because AI systems, particularly deep learning models, are black boxes. They transform input into output through millions of mathematical operations that even their designers don't fully understand. You can't ask the system why it flagged 3i Atlas. You can only observe that it did and work backward. This is functional for routine operations but potentially dangerous for unique events. Consider the stakes. If AI system misclassify something important as mundane, we might miss first contact, genuine existential threats, or paradigm-shifting discoveries. If they overclassify, flagging too many false positives, humans learn to ignore alerts and real dangers get dismissed. The balance is delicate, and we're trusting machines to maintain it. Then there's the security angle. If AI systems control what information reaches human astronomers, they're potential manipulation points. Not necessarily by hackers, though that's possible, but by institutional actors. If someone wanted to suppress discovery of something in space, they wouldn't need to control telescopes. They just need to adjust the AI's filtering parameters, make the system slightly less likely to flag certain types of anomalies. No dramatic censorship, just algorithmic nudging that keeps uncomfortable data below the threshold of human attention. There's no evidence this is happening with 3i Atlas, but the possibility exists structurally. We've created a system where machines mediate our access to the cosmos, and mediation always introduces the possibility of control. The question isn't whether bad actors could exploit AI astronomy, it's whether we'd know if they did. Meanwhile, AI capabilities are advancing rapidly. Systems now don't just flag anomalies, they generate hypotheses. When the AI detects something unusual, it searches physics databases for possible explanations, ranks them by likelihood, and presents the top candidates to human researchers. This is incredibly useful for speeding up analysis, but it also means the AI is shaping how we think about discoveries. The explanations humans consider first are the ones the machine surfaces. Alternative theories might exist but never get evaluated because they didn't make the algorithm's shortlist. This happened with 3i Atlas. Early AI analysis suggested outgassing as the most likely explanation for the acceleration anomalies. That became the default framework. Other possibilities, directed energy propulsion, gravitational interactions with dark matter, quantum vacuum effects, weren't seriously considered because they ranked lower in the AI's probability assessment. Maybe the machine was right. Or maybe it steered investigation away from correct but counterintuitive answers because its training data biased it toward conventional physics. The ultimate concern is this. We're approaching a point where AI systems don't just assist astronomical discovery, but determine what counts as discovered. If a telescope sees something but the AI dismisses it, did we really see it? If the AI generates an explanation and humans accept it without independent verification, who made the discovery? These aren't abstract questions. They're about who, or what, controls humanity's relationship with the cosmos. And right now, that control is quietly shifting from human astronomers to algorithmic systems that operate according to logic we don't fully understand and can't fully interrogate. 3i Atlas might be the first major astronomical event interpreted primarily by machines. It won't be the last. Part 13. Solar Drama. the Great Magnetic Flip. While everyone focused on 3i Atlas, the Sun was doing something it does every 11 years, flipping its magnetic field. Solar Cycle 25, which began in 2019, reached its maximum phase in 2025. The Sun's north magnetic pole became south, south became north. This is normal. It happens like clockwork. But normal doesn't mean unimpactful. During solar maximum, the Sun's activity intensifies dramatically. Coronal mass ejections hurl billions of tons of charged particles into space. Solar flares release energy equivalent to millions of nuclear bombs, and the radiation environment throughout the solar system becomes turbulent and unpredictable. 3i Atlas experienced its closest approach to the Sun during this chaotic period. That timing might explain everything. Comet tails are shaped by solar wind, streams of charged particles flowing from the Sun. During solar maximum, that wind becomes irregular. Strong gusts followed by calm periods. The comet's tail would respond dynamically, changing brightness and shape in ways that might look anomalous if you're not accounting for solar variability. Those unexplained brightness surges. Probably the comet passing through regions of enhanced solar wind that cause temporary increases in outgassing. The acceleration anomalies are similarly explainable. Comets are fragile. When one side heats up from solar radiation, ice sublimates into gas. That gas jets away from the surface, creating thrust like a natural rocket. If solar activity is irregular, the heating is irregular, and the thrust becomes unpredictable. 3i Atlas might have experienced asymmetric outgassing caused by patchy solar radiation during a turbulent period. The trajectory changes weren't artificial propulsion. They were just messy physics happening to a messy object. This explanation is mundane but powerful. It accounts for all observed anomalies using well-understood mechanisms. No aliens needed, no government tests, just a comet behaving exactly like comets behave when they encounter an active Sun. And yet this explanation hasn't dominated public consciousness. Why not? Partly because it's boring. Mystery is more engaging than solved problems, but also because the solar context doesn't get communicated effectively. When NASA releases data about 3i Atlas, they focus on the comet. Solar conditions get mentioned briefly, if at all, usually in technical appendices that general audiences never read. So people see brightness surges without the context of solar wind variations. They see trajectory changes without understanding the outgassing dynamics. The data is incomplete, not because it's censored, but because full context is complex and doesn't fit into headline-friendly narratives. But there's another layer. Solar activity affects more than comets. It affects satellites, power grids, communication systems, GPS accuracy, and most relevantly for our purposes, sensor reliability. When charged particles from solar storms hit telescope electronics, they create noise in the data. Brief spurious signals, temporary artifacts. Experienced astronomers know to filter this out. But if you're not accounting for solar interference, you might interpret those artifacts as real anomalies. Some of the unexplained features of 3i Atlas might be exactly this. Solar-induced sensor glitches that look like meaningful signals until you account for the radiation environment. And if those glitches happened to occur during moments when the comet was being observed intensely, they'd get recorded, analysed, and debated. The AI systems flagging anomalies might have been responding partly to real cometary behaviour and partly to sensor noise, unable to distinguish between them. This matters because it means some of the mystery surrounding 3i Atlas might be literally illusory. Not fake in the sense of deliberately created, but artifacts of observation rather than properties of the object. We're potentially seeing shadows cast by our own instruments, and interpreting them as features of the comet itself. That's not unprecedented. Astronomical history is full of false discoveries later revealed to be instrumental effects. Canals on Mars, Vulcan, the hypothetical inner planet. These weren't lies. They were observational errors compounded by expectation. And there's the psychological dimension of solar influence that's less discussed. Some researchers have documented correlations between solar activity and human behaviour. Increased aggression, elevated anxiety, disrupted sleep patterns. The mechanisms are debated, possibly electromagnetic, possibly just increased auroral activity affecting circadian rhythms, but the statistical correlations exist. If solar maximum genuinely affects human cognition and emotion, then the heightened reactions to 3i Atlas might be partly solar-driven. People were primed to be more anxious, more reactive, more susceptible to apocalyptic thinking because the sun itself was in an agitated state. This veers into speculative territory, but it's worth considering. The timing of 3I Atlas during solar maximum might have amplified both the observed physical anomalies and the human psychological response. The comet became a focal point for solar-induced anxiety that needed an outlet. Not orchestrated by any human agency but by cosmic coincidence. The universe itself creating the perfect storm of ambiguity. Yet even this solar explanation doesn't fully satisfy. Some observed features of 3I Atlas remain genuinely puzzling, even accounting for solar variability. The timing of certain brightness surges doesn't correlate with solar wind variations. Some trajectory adjustments seem larger than outgassing alone should produce. There are residual mysteries that solar physics doesn't cleanly resolve, which means either our understanding of solar-comet interactions is incomplete, or something else is genuinely happening, and that's where we are. Even the most scientifically rigorous explanations leave gaps. Small gaps, perhaps, but gaps nonetheless. And in those gaps, speculation flourishes. Because humans hate unsolved puzzles, we'd rather have a wrong answer that feels complete than a right answer that feels incomplete. Solar maximum explains most of 3I Atlas. Most isn't all. And that tiny remainder is where aliens, prophecies, and psyops continue to live, feeding off the residue of unexplained detail that mainstream science hasn't yet absorbed. The sun did its part to muddy the picture, but clarity remains elusive. Part 14, Synthetic Skies and Deep Fake Space. September 2025. The Tokyo World Expo unveiled something remarkable. A large-scale holographic display suspended in mid-air above the venue. Not a screen, not a projection onto water vapor or smoke. Actual volumetric imagery floating in three-dimensional space, created using femtosecond laser pulses that ionize air molecules into glowing plasma. The display showed rotating planets, spacecraft, even a simulated comet that moved across the night sky above thousands of spectators. The technology worked. It was visible from miles away, and it was indistinguishable from a real celestial object, unless you knew to look for the telltale shimmer of ionized air. This wasn't science fiction. This was a commercial demonstration. The company providing the technology, a Japanese firm specializing in atmospheric displays, announced plans to license the system for advertising, entertainment, and, interestingly, educational purposes. Imagine teaching children about astronomy by projecting the solar system into the actual sky above their school. Imagine navigation systems creating aerial waypoints visible without looking at screens. The applications are endless. But so are the implications. Because if you can create a convincing comet hologram over Tokyo, you can create one anywhere. The technology scales. Given sufficient power and the right atmospheric conditions, you could project imagery visible across entire regions. Not detailed close-up imagery, the resolution is limited by physics, but enough to simulate distant celestial objects. A light in the sky moving in ways that suggest alien origin. A formation of objects that behaves unlike satellites or aircraft. And most viewers would never suspect they're seeing ionized air rather than actual spacecraft. This revives the Project Bluebeam discussion, but with verified technology instead of speculation. The capability exists, not for projecting detailed religious figures or massive global hoaxes, but for creating aerial phenomena convincing enough to trigger exactly the kind of uncertainty we've seen with 3I Atlas. You don't need to fake an interstellar comet, but you could augment a real one, add artificial brightness surges, create the appearance of structured formations near it, enhance the mystery at key moments to maintain public attention. Is this happening? There's no evidence. But the fact that it's now technically possible changes the equation. Every unexplained light in the sky carries a new question. Is this natural, human-made terrestrial, or human-made apparent celestial? The categories multiply. Verification becomes harder, and the social impact is corrosive. If people believe the sky can be faked, they trust their own observations less. Reality becomes negotiable. Then there's the deepfake dimension. In June 2025, an academic paper demonstrated that AI could generate photorealistic astronomical images that fooled professional astronomers. The researchers trained a neural network on telescope data, then had it create images of non-existent celestial objects. Experts examining those images couldn't reliably distinguish them from genuine telescope captures. Some, fake images, even passed peer review when included in test papers submitted to journals. The implications are staggering. If AI can generate convincing astronomical imagery, then any image of 3i Atlas might be manipulated without detection. Not crude Photoshop work. Sophisticated generative models that maintain all the correct statistical properties, noise profiles, instrumental artifacts. A deepfake comet image would be pixel perfect. The only way to verify authenticity would be comparing multiple independent observations, and even that becomes questionable if multiple sources are using AI processing that introduces consistent biases. This creates an epistemological nightmare. How do we know what we're looking at? If NASA releases images, are they unmodified captures or AI-enhanced reconstructions? And if they're enhanced, which is standard practice for making data scientifically useful, where's the line between enhancement and fabrication? There's no clear answer. We've entered an era where even primary source data can be algorithmically manipulated in ways that leave no trace. The psychological impact is profound. During the Dubai Shopping Festival in 2024, a company projected an advertisement into the sky that showed what appeared to be a massive UFO. Social media exploded with panic before the company revealed it was a promotion. But thousands of people had genuinely believed they were witnessing alien contact. Not because they were gullible, but because the display was convincing. When reality can be manufactured this effectively, belief stops being about evidence and becomes about trust. Do you trust that what you're seeing is real? Do you trust that institutions aren't manipulating your perception? With 3i Atlas, this question haunts every observation. Even if the comet is completely natural, even if every anomaly is explainable, the mere existence of deepfake technology and holographic projection means some people will never believe it. They'll assume manipulation, and they won't be entirely paranoid. The capability for deception exists. The incentive structures for using it exist. The only thing we don't have is proof that it's happening. Yet. Open source astronomy becomes critical in this environment. If thousands of amateur astronomers with independent equipment can observe 3i Atlas and cross-verify their findings, that provides a check against institutional manipulation. The distributed nature of observation makes fakery harder. You can't control everyone's telescope, but even this has limits. Amateur equipment is less sophisticated. If anomalies are subtle, only professional-grade instruments might detect them. And if those instruments are few and controlled by institutions, the bottleneck returns. There's also the question of what gets faked and why. The assumption is that deception would make things seem more exotic than they are, turn a normal comet into something mysterious. But the reverse is possible. Maybe 3i Atlas is genuinely strange, and the deep faking is being used to normalize it. Replace authentic, unusual images with AI-generated conventional ones. Smooth out the anomalies in public-facing data, while keeping the real data classified. In this scenario, the fakery isn't creating mystery, it's suppressing it. Both possibilities lead to the same conclusion. We can't fully trust what we're seeing anymore. The technology has advanced beyond our ability to verify authenticity, and in that verification gap, every interpretation becomes defensible. Believers can claim any debunking is faked. Skeptics can claim any evidence is fabricated. Truth dissolves into competing narratives, none provable, all emotionally satisfying to their adherents. This is the synthetic sky, not a specific hoax, but a condition of permanent uncertainty, where the line between real and fabricated disappears. 3i Atlas exists. That's verified by multiple independent sources. But what it is, what it's doing, what it means, all of that remains contested. And the contestation isn't resolvable, because the tools we'd use to resolve it are themselves suspect. We're trying to measure truth with rulers that might be bent. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal isn't to make us believe any particular thing about 3i Atlas. Maybe it's to make us doubt everything. To demonstrate that in the age of synthetic media and holographic skies, belief is always a choice rather than a conclusion. You choose to trust NASA, or you don't. You choose to believe your own observations or question them. There's no objective anchor anymore, just competing claims and the technologies to support any of them. If that's the operation, it's already succeeded. Because here we are, unable to say with certainty what 3i Atlas is, despite months of observation and terabytes of data. The mystery isn't in the comet, It's in the impossibility of resolution. That impossibility is the real technology. And belief, our need to land on some answer despite the uncertainty, that's what's being weaponized. Part 15, the final question, belief as technology. We've traveled through scenarios, deep space defense tests, signal simulations, atmospheric experiments, predictive mythology, AI-driven belief modeling, quantum observation paradoxes, solar interference, synthetic skies. Each explanation fits part of the puzzle, but none fits all of it, and that incompleteness is itself a clue. Because 3i Atlas has revealed something more fundamental than whether it's alien or natural. It has revealed that in the 21st century, belief itself has become technology. Let's synthesize what we've learned. Human perception isn't passive. It doesn't record reality like a camera. It predicts it. Neuroscience has confirmed this again and again. The brain is a forecasting engine. It builds internal models of the world, guesses what's about to happen next, and only updates when reality diverges from those expectations. So what you experience isn't pure sensory input. It's mostly your brain's prediction of what it expects to see. The actual data streaming in from your eyes, your ears, your skin is thin, fragmentary, incomplete. Your consciousness fills the gaps with what it believes should be there. This isn't a flaw. It's how the brain copes with an overwhelming universe. It's how we make sense of chaos. But there's a price. Prediction-based perception can be hacked. If someone understands your expectations, your beliefs, your emotional triggers, your personal mythology, they can feed you inputs that align perfectly with that internal model. Your brain won't question it. It will accept it seamlessly because it matches the pattern it already trusts. And worse, once belief locks in, it becomes self-reinforcing. You'll defend it, rationalize it, even rewrite memories to protect it. Because reprogramming your predictive model is costly cognitively, emotionally, existentially. And that brings us back to 3i Atlas. Whatever this object truly is, comet, probe, fragment or fabrication, it has functioned as a belief technology test. Think about it. An ambiguous object enters our solar system. Its trajectory is odd. Its acceleration inconsistent. Its data stream fragmented by technical issues. Immediately, different groups around the world interpret it through their pre-existing frameworks. Scientists see a comet with curious dynamics. Religious communities see the long-foretold Wormwood prophecy made visible. Conspiracy theorists see a controlled event, a staged disclosure, a Project Bluebeam rehearsal. Each group experiences their version as truth. Why? Because each interpretation aligns perfectly with what they were already primed to expect. The object became a mirror, reflecting collective prediction. Its physical nature almost didn't matter anymore. It was a blank screen and humanity, the projector. Meanwhile, the management of information surrounding 3i Atlas seemed to understand this principle perfectly. Data wasn't hidden outright, just delayed. Language was cautious, open-ended. Images appeared, then vanished, then reappeared with updated calibrations. Nothing overtly deceptive, yet everything perfectly ambiguous. Enough to fuel endless speculation without providing definitive closure. That's not necessarily evidence of malice. It could be a carefully tuned communication strategy. Avoid panic, maintain engagement, preserve funding, study public behavior. But intentional or not, the outcome was the same belief suspended in productive uncertainty. Productive for whom? That's the question that lingers. If this was an experiment and there's growing reason to suspect it was at least partly that, what did it reveal? It showed that humanity can now inhabit multiple contradictory realities simultaneously without collapse. That institutional authority can maintain its narrative while countless alternative ones thrive online, and neither cancels the other out. That prophetic movements can be triggered, tracked, and allowed to extinguish themselves naturally. That AI can model, in real time, how belief spreads through networks like a contagion, predicting emotional reactions, virality curves, sentiment volatility. And perhaps most importantly, it showed that curiosity outweighs caution. Even when people suspect manipulation, they keep watching. They can't look away. Because uncertainty, properly managed, is addictive. That's not just a discovery about one comet. That's a discovery about the architecture of human consciousness. And from that discovery emerges something new, belief infrastructure management. control the information flow, shape the ambiguity, let people self-sort into their belief tribes, observe the distribution, intervene only when extremes threaten order. It's not dystopian in the old sense, not mind control, not censorship. It's subtler. It's a system that orchestrates uncertainty, keeps the collective mind oscillating between skepticism and wonder, disbelief and hope. A perfectly balanced hum of engagement. And yet, beneath the technocracy, there's something more ancient, a spiritual echo. Maybe this isn't manipulation at all. Maybe it's initiation. Maybe 3i Atlas is a cosmic riddle, a reminder that mystery itself is sacred, that not everything must resolve into a clean equation or an official statement. Ancient civilizations lived with mystery. They wove it into their cosmologies, their rituals, their art. They didn't solve the unknown, they honoured it. But modern humanity? We dissect mystery until it bleeds. We treat uncertainty as failure instead of invitation. Perhaps the cosmos is inviting us back into awe. Maybe that's the real lesson of 3i Atlas, that not every question deserves an answer, that reality itself might resist closure because the act of seeking is the point. Quantum physics already whispered this truth. Particles exist in superposition until observed. Reality, at its roots, is participatory. Observation changes what is observed. Maybe 3i Atlas isn't an alien probe or a psychological operation. Maybe it's a reflection of our own uncertainty collapsing into form, a cosmic-scale version of the quantum mirror showing us ourselves. And yes, there's always the simplest possibility. Maybe it's just a comet, a chunk of frozen rock tracing its lawful orbit, no hidden agenda, no message, no experiment. Maybe the mystery is entirely of our own making. That would be the most humbling revelation of all that humanity, desperate for meaning, invented the grand conspiracy to fill the silence of the stars. But even then, everything we've uncovered still matters, because the infrastructure now exists, the algorithms, the behavioral models, the AI systems that understand our belief mechanics. Whether they were used for 3i Atlas or not, they're operational, and they will be used again. The next anomaly, the next celestial event, the next cosmic revelation will activate the same machinery, the same curiosity loops, the same algorithms tuned to our wonder. So as December 15th, 2025 approaches, when 3i Atlas draws nearest to Earth's orbit, millions will look up. Some will see ice and dust. Some will see a messenger. Some will see a warning. Some will see the beginning of contact. But maybe, just maybe, what they'll all be looking at is a mirror reflecting the most advanced technology ever created the human capacity to believe.